Harvard Divinity School.
Uses and abuses of power in alternative spiritualities. Implications for spiritual care of patients and communities. April 28, 2023.
So, it's great to be on the panel. It was fun to put down some thoughts about this subject that have been rolling around in my head for the last number of years. And I'm going to read you some things today, a little bit that I've written, partially because I haven't really presented about this subject much. And so I think in some ways, if I try to explain it I don't think I'll be as clear as I will if I read some of the things I've written, because I really tried to get them down. So I'll do a mix of reading and presenting. Okay, let's see. So, move this a bit. So today is about, as it says, mysticism and its discontents. It's about the ways in which spiritual illumination creates its own blindness. And when we typically think about abuse or the way in which spiritual leaders may abuse their power or misuse their power, we basically come up with more or less three ideas. And I want to present today and speak about a fourth. So the three ideas are they're corrupt. They had a genuine spiritual attainment or realization, and have authentic awakening, but they fell prey to corruption or human weakness in some form or other. And that certainly is a good explanation. The second is they're delusional, they're self-deluded, and they didn't have a genuine awakening. And the third, of course, you hear a lot of people in the culture say, well, they were just frauds. They were just out for themselves or intentionally misleading people. So I want to propose a fourth possibility, that many of the challenges we find with spiritual illumination are tied up in the thing itself. And I call this the hard problem. It's like, how do we explain the paradox experienced by participants in some groups or communities, and certainly was true of mine, featuring charismatic leaders on one hand that have genuine and empowering insights and awakenings, and disempowering abuses and confusion. In other words, how do we explain the unenlightened behavior without explaining away enlightenment? So the hard problem is that some of these things are tied up together. And as I wrote here, I said, I want to propose a fourth possibility, that the blind spots that lead to abuse in some cases are in fact dangers inherent in the awakened state, that they may be an intrinsic feature of certain types of awakening. In other words, the bug and the feature are inextricably connected. Can we hold two real and enduring truths at the same time? Spiritual awakening both illuminates and blinds, and it may very well do both simultaneously, even inevitably. By stating this, I don't mean to impugn the timeless nature of non-dual consciousness, but there's a tendency to put mystical experiences up high on a precarious pedestal, to pursue them passionately, but often uncritically, to pursue the water of mystical insight like a dying man drowning of thirst, as the famous saying goes, but without questioning what will be the long-term impacts of drinking from that holy and ancient fountain. In other words, there can be an assumption that the experience of this water is inherently and intrinsically pure and good, and its impact upon our minds and hearts must inevitably result only in positive effects for all concerned. That the nature of touching something so deep and profound must spread illumination and positivity without complication or scar or unintended consequence. And I want to question this almost universal assumption, but to do so without questioning the immense value of mystical insight itself, and see if we can begin to glean some truths about enlightenment that might help all of us as we kind of walk this path. So to do that, I'm going to suggest three questions that we ask as we pursue this, and that we can ask ourselves as we pursue paths, as we can ask in our communities. And I should just say here that I'm going to use the words non-dual, mystical attainment, ground of being, enlightenment, spiritual attainment, all more or less to mean roughly the same thing. Now we could have, and I spent a decade on a magazine called What is Enlightenment? We could spend the next, the whole weekend debating and talking about the nuances of those issues, and I've done it. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to use those roughly interchangeably. So the first question, is mystical attainment seen as an end state? This is a delicate question because especially in the perennial philosophy, as we can see from this Aldous Huxley quote, which is very influential in the spiritual but not religious movement of the last 50 years, the perennial philosophy is expressed most succinctly in the Sanskrit formula, thou art that. The Atman, or immanent eternal self, is one with Brahman, the absolute principle of all existence, and the last end of every human being is to discover that fact for himself, to find out who he really is. So some mixture of the exploding popularity of non-dual traditions and the perennial tradition gave us this kind of idea of enlightenment or non-dual realization as sort of the top of the mountain. It's the apotheosis of human evolution, this kind of idea that's what we're aiming for, this kind of end state. And I think it's worth questioning that. I think it's worth questioning whether that's really true. As I will read you briefly here, it's delicate because the mystical revelation itself, whether experienced temporarily or an ongoing or permanent or semi-permanent way, often represents an experience of a completeness, a fullness, a nothing missingness. It has, we might say, a fragrance of finality. And the great temptation to conflate that experience with the actual state of our individual psychology is understandable. There's a natural desire to conflate the completeness of that which lies beyond, deep within, or the core of our being, with the completeness of one's own self. Because after all, I am that, thou art that. So what I mean is that the temptation to turn the ground of being into the goal of becoming can be overwhelming. Interpreting non-dual realizations of enlightenment as the end state of individual development, again, to turn the ground of being into the goal of becoming, is a pernicious error with significant implications. Such a mistake can distort even the most well-meaning teacher-student relationship. It reifies and entrenches imbalances of power. And while some hierarchy is always necessary in a student-teacher relationship, this error can harden, constrain, and entrench a hierarchy that is much better left open, flexible, and fluid. And I say all of that without in any way, while appreciating the beautiful nature of non-duality and that realization and all of the elements of it, without trying to step back from it, but interpreting it as an end state, and especially when we start to because it may, in some ways, it may represent an end, a certain type of end, but it doesn't necessarily represent the apotheosis of our personal evolution or cultural evolution. And that's what I'm trying to say. So the second question I want to propose here, how am I doing on time? Okay, good. I've got a long way to go now. How does mystical awakening blind as well as illuminate? So I got 4 issues I want to address here. So the first is, many people are familiar with the classic book, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. So the problem with the power of now. So this is a bit delicate. Now we're getting into some delicate territory and some double-edged territory. Again, the very avenue of illumination can be the avenue of blindness. And understanding that delicate mix is what I'm trying to capture here. So if we start with the presumption that we have a limited awareness or capacity for attention in our individual psyche, we might think of spiritual illumination as a light or spotlight that brings the background of an always already present consciousness into the foreground. Such an awakening may free us from our normal self-preoccupation, increasing our overall capacity for attention and awareness. It may bring us more fully and powerfully into the present alerting us to the extraordinary power of now, as Eckhart Tolle described it. It might break down some of our normal ego defense mechanisms so that we become more undefended, vulnerable as a human personality. All of those are potentially very positive developments and part of the purpose of spiritual growth. But they may also come with a price tag attached. Such an increased awareness of this ground of being might lead us to draw conclusions about the world of becoming that are clouded by the former perspective. Questions about life and the world that cry out for complex ethical considerations might seem unimportant, irrelevant, already resolved when seen through the eyes of the fullness at the core of self. The difficult convolutions of money, work, family, relationships may seem to fade to nothing in the revelations that flow from non-dual insight. That may initially seem like a positive thing until one genuinely tries to negotiate the complexities of psychological and cultural life by invoking the simplicities of core spiritual truths. The fathomless depths of self for all of its wondrous and liberating attributes is not by itself sufficient for confronting or solving the dilemmas that challenge us in the world of individual and cultural becoming. Here again, we see how the positive and the negative are tied together. And the point is not to separate them or rip them apart, but to recognize what we're dealing with. Number two, similar, the double-edged liberation from self-concern. A second point of illumination and obscuration is that the liberation of our attention into the immediacy and authenticity of the present may release our natural gifts and talents from being trapped by the fears and doubts of our self structure. And that's a welcome development. But again, these changes produce unaccounted for psychological impacts. This liberation of our awareness may result in new preferences and constraints. It may make us less inclined to pursue perspectives that are foreign to this new awakening, that are involved with the past or future, or that seem to re-engage doubts that have been left behind. This can be subtle but dramatic. We may be less inclined to look at ourselves and our own conclusions with the critical eye of an outsider. In other words, this awakening may liberate us from unhealthy self-doubt while diminishing our ability for healthy self-criticism. The result is a potent mix of powerful psychological freedom and unseen constraint. Again, this is not inherently problematic, but we need to stop pretending that there are states of consciousness where we can have it all. Absorption in the one or non-duality without any cost or change in our ability to productively and insightfully take other important and useful perspectives. There's always an opportunity cost in the finite world of time and space, even when we are dealing with gateways to the infinite. Let me say that again. There's always an opportunity cost in a finite world of time and space, even when we are dealing with gateways to the infinite. And if I could put that as like a poster on the rooms of spiritual leaders, I think the world might be a better place. So the third one is domain creep. And in some ways that speaks for itself, and I won't go through it in great detail, but there's something beautiful about the confidence that flows from spiritual revelation. You know, when you see a spiritual teacher who has some degree of realization, there's a kind of confidence in life. It's a confidence in not a confidence in an expertise or an area of expertise. It's a different thing. It's a confidence in no thing. It's a confidence in life. It's a confidence in consciousness as the foundation of what is. There's a beauty to that, but that is a kind of confidence I think it's hard to contain. It just naturally spills over. It spills over its boundaries. It wants to be confident about all kinds of things it probably shouldn't be confident about. It's just part of the way that works. I think it's a kind of inner confidence that naturally spills over its own boundaries. I say that humility is a hard hill to climb for anyone and becomes near impossible when the confidence of an ever-bubbling internal spring is continually overflowing its inner banks. There are many kinds of humility, but it takes a special form to not let the confidence and freedom derived from a non-dual state of consciousness to cross inappropriately into other domains of life, much less be willing to accept feedback or criticism about the same. And once again, this becomes even more difficult if there's some degree of narcissism in the picture. The fourth way I want to just illustrate how mystical awakening blinds as well as illuminates is what I'm calling the myth of the given. And, similar to the confidence, there's a kind of presence that spiritual leaders and authentic spiritual teachers can have. It's, people often will comment on this, a type of innocence that is characteristic of awakening, which is often celebrated in spiritual circles, and understandably so. A kind of sweetness, innocence, and deep presence is a powerful and delightful quality that spiritual leaders can have. And it may naturally arise as we inhabit a less distracted inner universe, as our consciousness becomes more transparent to the underlying depths of being. The quality of attention and the ability to focus that attention on the immediate content of consciousness, internal or external, is liberated as we become less fixated or caught in any one aspect of that content. This ability to freely inhabit higher states and other perspectives presented to us can be powerfully energized by awakening, and the insights that flow from that ability can be profound as we're free of some of our normal psychological barriers, but it can be double-edged. It can make us more convinced of the reality and relevance of the thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that arise in the presence of that heightened awareness. It can make us doubly attached to those thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. It can make us overconfident, full of conviction, less able to disengage from the content of our own heightened insight. It can make us more susceptible to the myth of the given, the idea that what arises or is given to our immediate consciousness is inherently real and true. Indeed, even as we become less attached to the passing of thoughts and feelings in our mind's eye, we may become more attached to the perceived relevance of the insights that flow from our inner intuitions, and less able to detach from those insights and intuitions. I may have one missing page here. Anyway, so the myth of the given, that's the other. I just stopped reading there, huh? It was good, huh? I was in it. Let me just. All right, so those are those four. Here we are. So the final question, how am I doing? Okay, good. I got one more, so I think we're good. Okay, so the final question I want to go into, in some ways, this may be the most controversial. To what extent does mystical awakening in this form or other select for a kind of psychological instability? And I think we have to be honest about this question. Like, we need to engage this question. So, and again, it's not to impugn or the beauty for all of us as we pursue these mystical truths. But I do think I'll read them. I've observed, and I'm certainly not the only one, that trauma and some forms of abuse, including sexual abuse, can set the stage for a personality or a psyche to have a propensity for spiritual, mystical, and paranormal experiences. The other person who's done some research on this is Jeff Kripal at Rice University. He's done some work on this. I remember I was with a conference with him, and he was talking about when he encounters someone who has a deeply paranormal experiences and psychic in some various ways. And he was saying that often he'll just kind of wait for them to tell them eventually about some of the trauma they have in their background. So I'm not familiar with any serious study of the mechanisms that cause this, but we can imagine how it might work. It seems that when the normal ego or self structures become dislodged, or some type of trauma forces a self to protect itself by a retreat into other parts of the internal universe, a doorway might open to another reality. Such disassociations can be catalytic for unconventional experiences. Some people have a lightning strike and wake up and find a paranormal doorway open. Some have near-death experiences and find that they are more prone to spiritual states or other forms of unconventional experiences. The same mechanisms, I suspect, may be at work when it comes to certain types of mystical or non-dual experiences. In my own research, I've seen that at least some of the individuals particularly prone to powerful mystical experiences are also those with less stable, less integrated self-structures, as if the ability to readily shift between various internal states of self made that person more vulnerable to higher states of consciousness. Of course, that's a generalization. I'm not in any way suggesting that the beauty and mystery of seeking for higher states of consciousness, spiritual growth, or transcendent experiences can be reduced or explained by an appeal to neurosis and trauma or particular psychology. That's a deep universal aspiration that can never be captured by that limited frame. But I want to raise the possibility of a relationship between certain psychological makeups and enlightenment experiences that could be activated given the right circumstances. We should consider the possibility that specific types of psychological personalities with particular instabilities driven by trauma or neurosis might be more prone to slipping into mystical states of consciousness. And most relevant, more prone to those states becoming permanent or semi-permanent. You know, people often talk about charismatic, enlightened gurus and teachers of the last decades as if we just had an unlucky run of unstable narcissists. But what if psychological instability in some form is the very personality trait that enables a particular mystical state of consciousness to flip over into becoming a more permanent or semi-permanent feature of the self? Not in every case, not in every situation, but enough to be important. Enlightenment, if this is true, may not be so much the apotheosis of the spiritual and evolutionary path, but a particular off-ramp on the mystical highway that reveals what happens when a certain type of psychological self-structure encounters a certain type of mystical experience. The result can be powerful and revelatory. It may result in a unique form of spiritual genius, like a mathematical prodigy or a musical talent. Fine. But it's hardly the pinnacle of some broad evolutionary ladder of development. Let's not turn an otherwise promising mystical realization into a recipe for confusion, false aspiration, cynicism, and even abuse. You know, it's worth saying that two of the most popular spiritual teachers right now in the country, Eckhart Tolle and Byron Katie, right? Sure, Byron Katie. I mean, you know, I met both of them. They're both lovely people. This is not to impugn them at all. And they're both powerful and people have beautiful experiences with them. So this is not a problem. But the vehicle or the catalyst for their awakening was suicidal ideation for both of them. At least that played a part, important part. So it's worth looking at this honestly. My hope is that pursuing these questions can help us with this hard problem. The one is the problems that hide within the realizations we love and seek, that may surprise us with their subtlety. And I think traditional religions may have mitigated the ways in which spiritual illumination creates its own blindness. But those lessons, to the extent they were ever fully intelligible, were largely implicit and may be less effective in the modern and postmodern worlds in which we are engaging these modalities. Today, we need to freshly examine these distinctions in a new context with decades of new data if we are to walk the spiritual path that we all love with wisdom and care. That's it. Thank you.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, President and Fellows of Harvard College.